All right, Panthers. So today we're going to talk about one of the most historic, one of the most remarkable, one of the biggest scandals ever to hit uh, the American government, and that is Watergate. The Watergate scandal destroys a presidency, costs him uh, his uh, his office. He resigns from office, and it really does a lot of damage in terms of the faith and confidence that Americans had in the government. All right, crazy story. It gets a bit confusing, so you got to stick with me, but here we go. So, the election of 1972. Richard Nixon is the incumbent. He's a fairly popular president. He's done a lot to expand the Great Society programs. He's expanded welfare and Medicare and Medicaid. Um, he's also begun to normalize relations with communist China and the Soviet Union. So there's a thaw in the Cold War. He's getting the United States out of Vietnam. So he's a fairly popular president, although he's very, very paranoid and very, very worried that people don't think he's the best candidate around or he's the best president around. So he desperately wants to prove that. The Democrats nominate a very, very liberal politician, a guy by the name of George McGovern for president. And George McGovern is a pacifist. George McGovern embraces a lot of very liberal government policies and philosophies. George McGovern never has a shot in this election. He's never going to beat Richard Nixon. Well, Richard Nixon wants to ensure that he wins, but not by a little bit, but by a lot of it. And there's an organization that he builds up around him to help him get reelected, and it's called CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. CREEP. Oh boy. And within CREEP, there's another group called the Plumbers. And the Plumbers, their job is to stop leaks, information leaks from the White House, but also to create information leaks from the Democratic Party. And just before the 1972 election, there is a break-in at the Watergate complex, and that's the building you see here in the picture. Now, Watergate was built as the building of the future in Washington, D.C. The idea was that you would live in this building and you could essentially stay here your entire life and you would never have to leave. There were grocery stores, there were schools, there were restaurants, there were movie theaters, there were workout centers, gyms, and such. There were office space, there were medical spaces there. There was nothing that you needed that wasn't in the Watergate building. So it was the building of the future. And in the Watergate building were the Democratic National Headquarters. And just before the election, there is a break-in, there's a robbery in the Democratic National Headquarters. And these men are arrested for that break-in. Now, initially, not a lot was thought about the break-in. They thought it was just a bunch of bumbling burglars, which they were. The way they went about this, to what they did was just lunacy and crazy. Like they were begging to be caught. So not a lot is thought about it. But after the break-in, things begin to rapidly fall apart. All right, so we get to election day. Richard Nixon wins big time. Big time. Richard Nixon wins every state with the exception of Massachusetts, which is where George McGovern was from. So now we've got Richard Nixon until 1976. However, things begin to Watergate. Congress begins to investigate the Watergate break-ins for a couple of reasons. One, it involved the Democratic National Committee, so they wanted to figure out if there was national implications here. But there were also rumblings that maybe the White House had something to do with it. So Congress begins to investigate Watergate just to see if there was anything there about that threatened national security or that tied the White House into it. During the investigation, they find out that Richard Nixon has an enemies list. And Richard Nixon had put on this enemies list just a list of people that he thought were against him or against the United States government. And he would do things just to harass and bother and make their lives generally miserable. They also found out that Richard Nixon was involved in possibly illegal fundraising activities. They also come to find out that Richard Nixon taped all of his conversations that took place in the Oval Office. Oh boy. So Congress asks for these tapes. They want to find out if Richard Nixon knew anything about Watergate. If he did, when did he know about it? And what did he do about it? Well, Nixon refuses to turn over the tapes. Nixon claims that he has what's called executive privilege. Nixon's argument is that there's things that are discussed on these tapes that could jeopardize American interests, that could jeopardize national security, that there are top secret things that really shouldn't be getting out into the public. And so his argument was he was not going to turn over the tapes. Goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, well, you do need to turn over the tapes, right? Supreme Court rules that Nixon does not have executive privilege in this matter, that the tapes need to be turned over. So Nixon compromises, and he goes on national TV, and he says instead of turning over the tapes, his secretary has transcribed, she's written out everything that's on those tapes. And he's willing to turn over the transcripts of the tapes. And there you see a picture of him giving this speech when he's going to turn over transcripts of the tapes, written documents of everything that's said on those tapes. Does Congress want the transcripts? No, of course they don't. They don't want the transcripts because there's a fear, right, that not everything is on the tapes is on the transcripts. You could leave stuff out. So Congress demands that they get the tapes. Again, the Supreme Court says you got to turn over the tapes. So Nixon reluctantly turns over the tapes. Congress begins to listen to the tapes. And they quickly realize there's a real problem. The tapes appear to be edited. There seems to be a long gap of missing conversation where they're having a conversation. You can hear men in the White House talking and laughing and talking about the upcoming election, and then all of a sudden, dead silence, just air. For several minutes. And then the recording picks back up again, and they're laughing and they're finishing up the meeting. Oh boy. So now Congress wants to know, where's this missing information on the tapes? Nixon says, oh gosh, it must have been a malfunction of the recorder. Maybe when my secretary was transcribing, she hit the button and erased a bunch of the tape. Oof. That doesn't sit well with Congress, and it doesn't sit well with the American public, who it now seems to appear that Nixon is trying to cover things up, trying to hide evidence. Oh boy, oh boy. Meanwhile, things just go from bad to worse for Richard Nixon. His vice president is the guy that you see in the picture there. His name is Spiro Agnew. What a name. Spiro Agnew. He's probably my all-time favorite vice president, not because he was a good vice president or he was a good guy, because he wasn't. He's just he's just entertaining. He's a crazy dude. He loved arguing with protesters. Loved it. So wherever he went, protesters showed up. And why did they show up? Because he would engage with them. And he would call them, he would yell at them, go take a shower, hippie. And he called the protesters the great unwashed. And he would argue with them, just crazy, crazy stuff. Well, it turns out that Spiro Agnew hasn't paid his taxes for a while. Whoop! Just slipped his mind. He forgot to pay taxes. Oh my goodness. So on August 1st, 1973, in the middle of all this Watergate scandal and the missing, tape and all this stuff, Spiro Agnew resigns the presidency. Oh boy. So now Richard Nixon has to appoint a new vice president. Well, he appoints a representative, a Republican representative from Michigan. And he's somebody that both Republicans and Democrats both like. He's a really, really nice guy, really good guy. He has no scandal at all around him, which is exactly what Richard Nixon needs at this point. He appoints Gerald Ford, Republican representative from Michigan, as his new vice president. After this, things begin to go downhill really, really quick for Richard Nixon. Saturday Night Massacre. Oh boy. So Richard Nixon goes on TV and he announces to the American public that he's hiring a special investigator to, quote unquote, get to the bottom of Watergate because the American people have a right to know whether their president's a crook or not. Well, I'm not a crook, is what Richard Nixon says. So he appoints this special investigator to investigate Watergate, to get to the bottom of Watergate. And his name is Archibald Cox. You can see his picture there. So he hires Archibald Cox to investigate Watergate and figure out what's going on. Now, Nixon believes that since he appointed this guy, since he gave this guy his job, that this guy would investigate Watergate in a way that would not make Nixon look bad, that Nixon, in a way, could control the investigation. Well, Archibald Cox begins to investigate, and he begins to do exactly what he was appointed to do, to investigate Watergate and figure out really what happened. And as word begins to get back to Nixon that Archibald Cox is really doing what he's supposed to do, and it's not going to go well for Nixon, Nixon calls his attorney general, Elliot Richardson. You see Elliot Richardson there. He calls him on October 21st, 1973, which is a Saturday night. And he tells Elliot Richardson, you are in charge of Archibald Cox. You are the attorney general for the United States. You're in charge of all these investigations. Elliot Richardson, Archibald Cox is not doing his job, and you need to fire Archibald Cox because he's wasting money and he's not investigating Watergate the way he said he was going to investigate Watergate. And Elliot Richardson tells the president, Mr. President Nixon, says, Mr. President, I've been monitoring what Archibald Cox is doing. I know what Archibald Cox is up to. Archibald Cox is doing exactly what he's supposed to do. He's investigating Watergate to the best of his ability, and I am not going to fire him for doing that. So Richard Nixon said, fine, you're fired. And he fires he fires Elliot Richardson. He then calls the deputy attorney general, second in charge of attorney general. And he tells the deputy attorney general, I just fired Elliot Richardson because he wouldn't fire Archibald Cox. Archibald Cox is not doing what he's supposed to do. You are now the new attorney general, so you need to fire Archibald Cox. And the new attorney general says, Mr. President, like Elliot Richardson, I've been monitoring what Archibald Cox is doing. He's doing exactly what he was hired to do, and I will not fire Archibald Cox. So Richard Nixon said, fine, you're fired. Calls the next guy, this guy, Robert Bork. And he tells Robert Bork, I fired Elliot Richardson. I've fired the deputy attorney general. You are now the new attorney general, and you need to fire Archibald Cox because he's not doing what he's supposed to do. And Robert Bork says, Mr. President, I will do that. Robert Bork, now acting as the attorney general of the United States, calls Archibald Cox and tells Archibald Cox, you're fired. Oof. So in the span of a few hours on a Saturday night in October of 1973, 3 people connected to Watergate or to the White House are fired by Richard Nixon for the Watergate investigation. Richard Nixon wants Archibald Cox, who he appointed to the job to investigate Watergate. Richard Nixon wants Archibald Cox to be fired. He tells Elliot Richardson to do that. Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General of the United States, says, Mr. President, I will not do that because there's not a reason to fire him. Richard Nixon fires Elliot Richardson. He then calls a Deputy Attorney General, tells him to fire Archibald Cox. Deputy Attorney General says, I will not do that because Archibald Cox is doing exactly what he was asked to do. So then Richard Nixon fires him, calls Robert Bork, tells Robert Bork, you need to fire Archibald Cox. Robert Bork does. This is the Saturday Night Massacre. Oof! In the span of a couple of days, Richard Nixon, or in the span of a couple of hours, I'm sorry, on one Saturday night in October of 1973, Richard Nixon fires 3 prominent government officials who are tied into Watergate. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Things just spiral from there. Nixon has lost all faith in the American people. The American people are very, very fed up. They're very angry with Richard Nixon and what seems to be this Watergate cover-up scandal. Barry Goldwater, the top-ranking Republican official in the Senate, in July of 1974, goes and tells Richard Nixon, with a large delegation of Republican elected officials from Congress and the House of Representatives. And they sit down with Nixon and they tell Nixon, Mr. President, there are enough votes in the House of Representatives to impeach you. There are enough votes in the Senate to have you removed. Mr. President, this is over. You need to either resign or you will be removed from power. And at this point, Richard Nixon had kind of lost all touch with reality. He's not sleeping. He is drinking very heavily. He's carrying on conversations with paintings around the White House. There was fear from Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State, that Richard Nixon was not mentally stable at this point to be president, and they were giving him the wrong nuclear launch codes. And now Barry Goldwater, the most prominent, the most respected Republican senator for sure, but one of the most respected and prominent senators just in general, has now come to Richard Nixon and told him, it's time for you to go. You need to leave. So on August 9th, Richard Nixon submits this letter to his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, and resigns the presidency. First president to do so. And with that, Richard Nixon resigns from the White House in disgrace over his role tied to the Watergate scandal. He was sending hush money. It was found out that he had authorized the sending of campaign donations, money that was intended to be used for his reelection campaign. He was sending money to the people who were involved in the Watergate break-in as hush money to keep them quiet. And that the Richard Nixon administration was involved in Watergate, trying to get information on a Democratic National the Democratic campaign in 1972. So it cost Richard Nixon his presidency, and he resigns in disgrace. And this is the last photograph of Richard Nixon just before he boarded the helicopter, leaving the White House, and as president of the United States. And we're done. All right, Panthers. Make sure you turn the notes in, and we will talk to you later.